Hello everyone and good morning and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Lorna and I am the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands. We have Skye and Lochailsh Archive Centre in Portree, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, and the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland. There's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks, but if you're able to donate towards the work of the service, then we're very, very grateful for those who are able to do that. Thank you very much indeed. Hi everyone, I'm seeing hellos coming in. Yes, very blustery here as well. Very wet in Stornoway. It's not quite wet here, but it is blustery and horrible. So thank you everybody for liking the hair. I hope you enjoyed last week's Learn with Lorna. Last week we looked at the subject of whisky, the history of whisky and whisky in the collections, and it was really nice, given that I don't drink any, to hear some people who do saying that it was a good summary of whisky, so I was glad about that. This week we're continuing our theme of food and drink by looking at the subject of food for rich and poor. I had thought to broaden out a little bit to look at food within institutions as well, so schools, the asylum, the prison and so on. But actually when I came to write it, there was such a lot already in it that I didn't put that in, so I'll maybe come back to that in another week. But I thought it was interesting, speaking about whisky last week, that it was one of the foodstuffs which has always transcended class and poverty and wealth, in that we spoke about rich people using it to toast events, to drink whisky at balls and occasions and so on, but also about those the people who were illegally distilling whisky because their poverty was such that they would do anything at all to be able to make some money and to have drinks for themselves as well. And so I thought that was really interesting as I came to write this week's one about the difference between rich and poor. But I wanted to start this week's talk with a look at the precariousness of life for the poor, and the way in which that very much living on the edge is reflected in food. So obviously for many generations the poor would have no savings, no or very little ability to refrigerate food or store food for any length of time, no ability to freeze other than if you had access to an ice house, which most people wouldn't, and therefore very, very limited capacity to buy up in advance and store food. And so therefore it would take one bad harvest, or heaven forbid several consecutive bad harvests, to have a huge impact on a large percent of the population. And so I'm going to start with an extract from the first statistical account for the parish of Duthel, which would go on to become Duthel and Rothimarcus. This is from 1792, and I think it really illustrates that that impact on that precariousness of life. The situation of the parish in 1782 and 1783 was truly distressing. Had it not been for government bounty and Sir James Grant's large supplies from distant countries, the poorer class of people would have perished. So great was the destruction of the crop in 1782 by the frost setting in so early as the month of August, that the most substantial corn which was sent to the home of the mills of this parish was a crop of wild oats from a piece of ground which had been ploughed but not sown. So they're saying that there was no the crop completely failed. The only thing that survived to be sent to the mills was wild oats that had happened to self-seed. From various observations made upon this kind of grain, it appears to have been a spontaneous production, so that should oats by some calamity be swept off the face of the earth, it might be regained by a proper cultivation of this species of grain, offensive as it is. So they're saying this is, a rubbish thing to eat, but it did survive through the worst conditions, and therefore we need to remember that in case we need to generate food again. It goes on to say, in 1680, as nearly as can be recollected, there was a famine in this and the neighbouring counties of the most fatal consequence. The poorer sort of people frequented the churchyard to pull up messes of nettles, being the earliest spring greens, which they greedily fed upon boiled without meal or salt. So people eating anything they can get their hands on. So many people perished from want that for 6 miles in a well-inhabited extent, within the year there was not a smoke remaining, so no family remaining within 6 miles. Nursing women were found dead upon the public road, and babes in the agonies of death sucking at their mothers' breasts. Numbers, to avoid the horror of their bodies being exposed, finding the near approaches of unavoidable death, crawled to the churchyard for the purpose of more immediate interment, that the earth which had denied them subsistence might piously receive their remains into its bottom. I think that's an absolutely extraordinary sentence that, you know, it's a very dramatic reading, and of course we don't know how much of that was dramatically written, how much of that was fact, but just that wording of that they crawled to the churchyard, that the earth which had denied them subsistence might receive their remains instead. So, as I say, a tragic and very dramatic extract, but it really gets across that point about life on the edge, and if the crop failed, or if there was a bad fishing season, huge swathes of the population would suddenly have nothing. And that's echoed right across the statistical accounts, from everywhere from Kincardine and Ross and Cromarty to Far in Sutherland to really a wide geographical area. The statistical accounts for Lathrum and Caithness refer regularly to the importance of the fishing industry, both for feeding the population and also for providing them with an income. And the impact that if the fishing season was unsuccessful, that huge impact on the population. And in the 1840s, there was a huge series of crop failures, which led to complete devastation across the Highlands. Going back to Lathrum in Caithness, the 1845 statistical account records it like this. So 1845 this was, we'll come back to that. So this is talking about Lathrum, and it refers to the fact that despite the hardships that the parish has undergone, the people of the parish have remained, I'm not going to say upbeat, but have remained remarkably stoic, and that it hasn't influenced their religious beliefs. So it says, during the past 3 years, when, as well known, the crops were almost a total failure all over the Highlands, the patient resignation and deep submission with which this heavy calamity was borne could not fail to excite the admiration of every attentive observer. Instead of riot, robbery and bloodshed, which in many other quarters followed the train of less formidable privations, here the public peace was never disturbed, but on the contrary, life and even property in general were as alike secure as in more favourable circumstances. So he's saying there's absolutely no kind of civil unrest caused as a result of this famine. But, he goes on to say, to behold 7,000 people suffering under the most distressing destitution for 3 successive years, many families without a handful of meal in their houses for weeks together, others satisfied with a little water gruel once a day, and still nothing but quietness and submission prevailing. What a triumph for that sound scriptural education to which they are early habituated, and consequent religious principle which it seldom fails to be productive. And he goes on to say, a high veneration for the being, attributes and worship of the deity is everywhere observable, which is, I find, really interesting, because it's you know, he's paying a compliment to the way they've handled the crisis, but also there's that long held belief that, you know, if you're poor and you're suffering, you should suffer well, you should suffer gratefully, and acknowledge that this is God's role for you right now, which is, I think, a little bit difficult to hear. Another example of this can be found in the correspondence of Tongue Parochial Board. So we hold a large collection for Tongue Parochial Board, and they talk about in 1847. There's a letter there which reads, So this is a group of people writing to Tongue Parochial Board for support, and they say, humbly sheweth, so they're saying we're writing for this reason, that owing to the total failure of the potato crop, the severity of the winter, and the entire want of labour in the parish, your petitioners are reduced to the lowest degree of poverty and distress. That many, having had no meal in their families for weeks, having subsisted entirely on boiled turnips and other such vegetables as they could with difficulty from time to time procure. That your petitioners acknowledge with gratitude the exertions made by the factor on the estate of Fowls and the farmers of the district to try and furnish meal in small quantities. That while this meal is being sold for ready money only, such is the poverty of the great majority of your petitioners having no money and without any prospect of lucrative employment, that they can't procure even the smallest supply for the support of themselves and their family. May it therefore please you, honourable gentlemen, to adopt such measures as can secure constant employment to the labouring classes of this parish, at a rate of wage commensurable with the highest price of provisions, and please devise such means as you in your wisdom may deem proper for alleviating the present distress and saving a famishing people from all the horrors of starvation and death. Signed by 69 individuals. That one dates from 1847, and you'll remember that I said the Lathrum one dated from 1846. And in that Lathrum one where they said, there's been no riots, there's been no civil unrest, everybody's just really coping very well with this crisis. It's really sad to read that. Well, it's really sad to read that anyway, but it's sad to read that with our hindsight, because we know that a year later, 1846 into 47, there was a widespread potato blight, famines almost worse than others that had been seen before, and then a very harsh winter on the back of it. And so there's a very clear understanding from our point of view retrospectively that although everything had been calm up until now, everything was really about to kick off. So that one was the first one from Lathrum, the second one from the Ross and Cromarty Commissioners of Supply, this one from Tongue Parochial Board. Again, a letter written to the board. We hold correspondence for Tongue as well. And this is someone in Achinver writing in March 1847, so after that big crop failure and then that harsh winter, saying, "Dear Sir, the bearer or some person from this district goes your length to apply to you for some help from the poor's money to keep this woman alive." So they're writing on behalf of this lady and saying, please give her some money to survive. She has barely a thing to support her, and she is not able to work for some years back. But when the times were thriving in the potatoes, she got a little land from her neighbours that kept her alive, but that was done away with this year by the failure of the potatoes. Crick McKenzie is the name of this poor creature. She is a great object and she has nothing to depend on. So you can see there the widespread impact on a population, but also that very personal impact on that one lady, Crick McKenzie, and somebody writing to say she has nothing because this failure has taken away everything from her. And I've spoken before about Jim Hunter's book, Insurrection, Scotland's Famine Winter, and that focuses exactly on that devastating period of the crop failure, the harsh winter, and the desperation and riots that followed. So as I say, mentioning there in the Lathrum extract that there was no civil unrest, within a year, Caithness and everywhere else would see riots. When I spoke about the Wick Harbour Trust record, some of you may remember that episode about the Wick Harbour Trust collection, and I spoke about the Wick grain riots of 1847, when, despite the Caithness crofters starving, grain was shipped out of the country to be sold at profit abroad. So I won't go into that whole story again, but it's just an illustration of the fact that there were riots, troops were called in, and the poor relief records in Wick record passers-by getting caught in that crossfire, literally caught in the crossfire. Some landlords were compassionate, so that Ross and Cromarty Commissioners of Supply extract mentions the gratitude to the Munro Fowles family and the local farmers for supplying whatever they were able to, but of course that really depended on what they were able to supply as well. And we have records in our Fraser Tytler collection which illustrate the compassion shown by William Fraser Tytler, who was both a landowner and the sheriff substitute of the county. And this is, again, it appears in Jim Hunter's book. But I wanted to tell it again here because I think it's just incredibly relevant to the subject of rich and poor. In 1846, in the midst of that crisis and this particularly bad crop failure in winter, a ship carrying 6,000 barrels of flour ran aground between Harris and North Uist. And rather than watching this flour dissolve into the sea, the starving people of Berneray went onto the wreck and took the flour off it to use. But technically that was theft, even though the ship was about to sink and the flour was about to be lost for everybody. It was technically theft, and therefore 8 of the people who had gone onto that wreck and taken the flour were sent to prison in Inverness. William Fraser Tytler, who, as I say, was a local landowner but also notably the sheriff substitute, was so moved by the desperation that had led the men to steal it in the first place, that he visited them regularly in prison before arranging for them to be released with nothing more than an admonishment. He gave them work on his own estate before paying their passage home. But in the interim, he wrote letters which we hold, ensuring that the men's family were supplied with both heating and peat and food. And this is one of those letters. So it's written from Aldowry, which was the family house, on the 22nd of January 1847. To the Reverend D McConaughey. And he writes, "My dear sir, I went into town yesterday to see these poor fellows from Harris, who I was much concerned to find them sent down to our jail here, having written to the Lord Advocate on hearing of the case, with the hope of preventing this." So he'd already written to say, look, they shouldn't be going to jail, but it had happened anyway. And so he then acts on it, goes to see them in prison. He says, "I wish I could have held a more satisfactory communication with them, but my want of Gaelic prevented this. Such as I had interested me much, and before leaving town I wrote again to the Lord Advocate and also to my substitute, Mr. Charles Shaw. To the former, suggesting that the moderate bail should be taken, which I doubt not we should find among the constables here, or that they should be liberated on their own reconnaissances, so saying that there should be a very low bail amount set, and to be honest, people locally will probably pay that. To Mr. Shaw I wrote requesting him to see that none of their families suffered any additional privation, either as to food or peat, from their absence. I have written to him again today requesting that it be known to their families that I have seen the men well and comfortable yesterday, and busily engaged in earning something for them at home." So that compassion for visiting the people, but also making sure their family at home were not only physically looked after in terms of food and fuel, but also an importance to say, just let them know that I've spoken to their families, they're okay, I've spoken to the men in prison, they're okay. This morning's post brought me a donation from a benevolent friend of £50, and I have immediately transmitted it to Mr. Shaw, £25 for South Uist and Barra and £25 for Harris for private distribution among the most necessitous cases that may be under his view. This will enable him to fulfil my commission of yesterday as to the families of those men in jail. I understand you to have seen them yesterday shortly before I did. Will you also have the goodness to communicate to them that I hope soon to have them liberated on bail, and also inform them as to the instruction I have given for the support of their families in their absence. I saw enough of the men's feelings yesterday to know how necessary it is for their peace of mind that they should know that their families are being supported in their absence. If this case is to go to trial, pray tell them that I will give them work and wages with my labourers until it shall come on and the result be known. I know I need make no apology to you for giving you this extra trouble." So there's a real compassion there for the people in jail, so to visit them, to speak to them, to physically look after the family, to tell the family that the men are okay, but also to tell the men, just so you know, I'm looking after your family as well. So a very compassionate example, and not typical of every landowner. The other thing William Fraser Tytler did when those men were in prison was he questioned them about the state of affairs in North Uist, South Uist, Harris and so on. So he says, tell me about what's happening in your communities. And in another letter he says that in this there is much that they told me that gives cause for reflection in these statistics. And he says not only for the present but also for the future. So there's a long-term awareness there of taking these statistics into account and saying, look, this is a problem, and this isn't a problem that's going to go away as soon as there's a good harvest, because this is going to happen again if we don't get to the root of the underlying problems. Now, obviously not all food poverty comes from a one-off crop failure, and there have always been, and there continue to be, people who just find it a daily struggle to put food on their table. And among the records that we hold reflecting this are the records of the Inverness Soup Kitchen from 1862 to 1888. The soup kitchen provided food to those in need of basic sustenance. So again, that's not related necessarily to a particular crisis. This is just people whose constant life is on the breadline. The records of the soup kitchen show the names of the people supplied with soup, where they lived, the number of people in their family, and the number of people supplied with soup, and any other remarks. So for instance, Ewan MacDonald of Factory Street had 9 of a family, and 4 of them were supplied by the soup kitchen. So there must have been a kind of means testing to the effect that, yes, you've 9 of a family, but you've got enough to feed some people, so we'll feed a percentage, and that leaves us things to supply other people. I mentioned that there was a remarks column, and that's really only used to indicate in cases where soup wasn't given. So for instance, Alexander Grant, he had a family of 7, but they weren't deemed to be in sufficient need of soup because he was a tailor in regular employment. Archibald Taylor, his remarks column reads, an able-bodied labourer with a wife and 1 child only. So the implication that you only have 1 child, therefore you should be able to feed that child, as opposed to the family of 9, where the same work wouldn't be able to provide for the same number. Wouldn't be able to have wouldn't go as far in a bigger family. So those are some of the records that we hold that talk about food, the relationship between the poor and food. There are numerous others, particularly I know beloved by many of us, including Fiona Newton. The Dewar Report evidence also talks about the relationship between poverty and food. But I'm going to stop there on that subject and move on to have a look at some of the records that we hold relating to the food for the rich. I'm going to start by looking at something a little bit unusual that covers food for a range of budgets, actually, so it's a nice one to cross over between the two halves. As you'll know, we very rarely hold published material, but one of the published collections we do hold is the 1893 Encyclopedia of Practical Cookery, and it includes recipes for the poorest and the wealthiest households. So there's a real cross-section of whatever your budget was, there would be something there. If you could afford the books in the first place, there would be something there that you could make. So for instance, so we'll have some votes about what we think about these meals. Tripe salad, blackbird pie, potato sandwiches. Potato sandwiches, incidentally, sound much better than the name would suggest. Vinegar eels. The picture of vinegar eels looks like a petri dish or some sort of scientific experiment. It's really unpleasant. Water pudding. Windbags. I don't know if you could ever invite someone for dinner and offer them windbags, which is made of butter, water, flour, eggs, and sugar, cooked in a pan and then cooked in the oven. The volume also includes artist drawings of banquets and sample menus from notable events. So, for instance, the election dinner of the Aberdeen Harbour Commissioners and the dinner given by the Glasgow Juridical Society on the 22nd of December 1892. And so there's obviously, they're catering for people who don't have much budget, but also they are giving examples of, if you are in a position to host a dinner party, here's the sort of thing people are hosting at the moment. So this is the example of the menu for the Glasgow Juridical Society. And you'll have to bear with my pronunciation. Okay, so it starts with preliminary pleasures, cockaliki and mock turtle soup. Grantus compiscatus, I don't speak Latin, but that's the fish course. It includes boiled turbot, lobster sauce, fried fillets of sole with tartar sauce. Then the entrees, oyster patty, mutton cutlets and tomato sauce. And then insubstantiabilis, which is the main course. Sirloin of beef, boiled turkey, saddle of mutton, celery sauce, York ham. After that, there's a course of roast pheasant, then risotto and morceau, apricot pudding, gâteau à la parisienne, blancmange, wine jelly, and then at the end, it just has the sentence, ne plus ultra in nihil et rem. And I say I don't speak Latin, but the ultimate point of possible achievement is what it says at the bottom. So we've reached the peak. That's us finished the menu. But you can see in there the fashionable use, which is still long-standing, of Latin and French within the menu, and of course they're lawyers as well, so they'll be very familiar with that. But the influence of fashionable food there. So the mock turtle soup, the lobster sauce, gâteau à la parisienne, wine jelly, and this is all happening, only sort of 40 years after that massive crop failure and the widespread devastation. We hold other menus in our collections as well. So, for instance, we hold menus for the Burns Club, the Caledonian Societies, things like that. The Burns Club having chilled Drambuie syllabub. You might like that, Jenny. We also have menus for the luncheon provided at the 1931 Freedom of Inverness Borough ceremony for the Prince of Wales. So that included things like mayonnaise of Ness salmon, mint and lamb sauce, and a wide range of wines and spirits and liqueurs and so on. So menus can tell us some things, and yeah, absolutely, Penny, an awful lot of food. So it's not only the variety, it's the quantity. And also we start to see in that 1931 Freedom Ceremony, mayonnaise of Ness salmon. So we move into, as you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure, at the stage we're at now, where having local food is a really good thing. It's if you can afford to have brand new, fresh local food, that's a good thing. Whereas going back a while, it was if you could afford something from out with the area, that was the high profile thing. It's a really interesting comparison. But the greatest insight into the eating habits and practices of the wealthy can be found in our large estate collections. So, for instance, D456 Baillie of Denane collection, which I focused on a few weeks ago, includes, amongst all sorts of other things, a large number of bills and receipts. And the bills are a great way of getting an understanding of the life of wealthy families in the past. So Baillie particularly contains dozens of bundles of hundreds and hundreds of receipts and bills from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, including things like just everyday life, so cutlery, carpentry, pew rent, clothing, millinery, ironmongery, dressmaking, coal, books, subscriptions to worthy causes and buildings being erected, haircutters, jewellers, chemists, so on. There's also a receipt for a pair of turtle doves. I don't know why that was. I'll need to investigate that. But there are, of course, within that, a large number of receipts to do with foodstuffs, including payments or bills for honey, oatmeal, groceries, confectionery, milk, butter, wine, spirits, greengrocers, and so on. And it really gives an insight into the difference between the lives of the poor and the wealthy at the exact same time. Many of them date from the 1830s, 40s, 50s, the very period that we started with talking about, with that intense period of famine. So there were hundreds of people starving in the Highlands. In our Lochaber Archive Centre, we hold the Kilmally parochial board records, and one entry in there says that over half of the population of this parish is in desperate need of emergency food, and that what we have will only last for a matter of weeks. And at the same time, we have these receipts for such luxury items like confectionery. There are payments to pastry cooks, to dairies, to all sorts of suppliers. For instance, there are receipts for 4 dozen Seville oranges, Edinburgh ale, the best old port, London stout. So these are things that are being brought in from out with to be able to have the best quality. And another large family and estate collection which we have, which has loads of interesting references to food and drink in it, is D538, the Munro of Navarre collection. There are references within this collection not only to the purchase of food and drink, but also to the staff who cooked and served them. And that's the other difference between the classes, is all of this food is being cooked for you and given to you by somebody else. So in Monroe of Navarre there are receipts for payments to the housekeeper, including for a leg of beef that she had bought for the household. There are butler's books and bills and vouchers from the 1770s through to the 1790s. The 1791 butler's book for Navarre has a page entitled An Account of Different Wines and Spirituous Liquors Made Use of at Navarre House. And I wish you could see the spelling of that, because the spelling is marvellous. The butler's book reveals that at Navarre, by far the most frequently drink was claret. And that's really echoed in the borough records as well. We can see in the treasurer's accounts that at every occasion the whole of the borough town council would drink claret. But other favourites within that butler's book are port and Madeira and sherry. It also references sweet wine, hock, rum and brandy, but drunk much less frequently. The cook and the housekeeper also appear in the Monroe of Navarre records in the form of recipe books. So the cook had recipe books from the 1800s that we have copies of. And here's the cook's recipe for snow pudding. I'd like to see someone do this. If you're not up for making windbags, please could you make snow pudding instead? Soak half a sixpenny sachet of gelatin in a half pint of cold water. Add half a pound of loaf sugar, juice of 4 lemons and whites of 2 eggs. Put lemon juice and gelatin through a sieve, switch it all up until very light and spongy, and then pour in a mould. Turn out into a glass dish and serve with custard. So just the number of ingredients there, I mean that's not a huge number of ingredients, but there's gelatin, there's sugar, there's lemons, there's eggs. And when we're looking at those early records, we're talking about potato and meal, really. The other thing that's in the Monroe of Navarre collection are inventories of the wine cellars. So you get an idea of the stock that's kept in reserve to be used. And there's also lists of food that was purchased for the household, so lists of fruit, which again we know from various aspects of our history that if more people had access to fruit, there would have been better health. Receipts for alcohol, so particularly there's one for a James Allen's wedding, for which the family bought 3 dozen bottles of porter, 9 bottles of spirits for punch, 4 bottles of whiskey for a wedding. And also, which I find really interesting, lists of fish purchased. So there's lists of lobster, crab, haddock, both bought directly from the fishermen, but also had sent to them from Tain, which is 17 miles away. So a real interest in where the food's coming from as well. There's also a list of swine bought by the family to be made to be used as ham for the family. I found that one particularly interesting because that's the first time really that we've looked at meat for, that's a huge difference between the poor and the wealthy. But that list of swine shows where they were purchasing it from. So it was being purchased from markets, from neighbouring estates, from Navarre Inn, and those receipts show the weight of each pig and the cost of each pig. So as I say, particularly interesting there to see meat as a regular thing on a menu, which it was not for those who didn't have the money for it. And you can also see that in our Cameron of Lochiel collections. There are game lists. So there's the lists of the game shot on the estate, so venison, grouse, ptarmigans, hares, woodcocks, ducks, partridges, and so on. And so that plays into the difference between diet as well. Our big family and estate collections also hold general grocery lists. So things like the purchase of raisins, currants, rice, Jamaica pepper, green tea, cardamom, sugar. So things that are coming from out with. Really interesting that in the Navarre collection, in that same bundle, there's also their records of them supplying meal to the poor. So there is a social conscience, there is a support to make sure that the poor have food, but it's meal. So there's meal and potatoes as opposed to the diversity of food that the wealthy were eating. So we've touched on meat and game and sugar and rice and seasonings, so both sweet and savoury seasonings, sugars and peppers and so on. And also the variety of locations that it came from. As I say, there's things that couldn't be produced locally, so Seville oranges, rice, sugar. those things are coming from out with, but also the variety of places being purchased from locally. So purchasing from hotels, from estates, from direct from the fishermen. And I think it just really, really illustrates the variety of food that they were eating and the quantity and the luxury items. There are things in there like confectionery that have absolutely no requirement. They're not giving you any benefit. They are purely a pleasure food. The other thing that these are great for, incidentally, is seeing the letterheads of different businesses. So a lot of those receipts or bills have come with the letterhead of the company. So really interesting for seeing businesses that don't exist any longer or businesses that do exist. So yes, you can see the inequality there, of course, in what they were eating, but also the inequality in that supply chain, that if you are living on meal and potato and something goes wrong, which it could do very easily, you have nothing. Whereas if you have that ability to have a wide diet, a broad range of things from different locations, and of course fundamentally the money to buy it, then your life is much less precarious, and your diet and your ability to feed your family is much less precarious. I feel like I've rushed through a lot of information there, so I hope it was interesting, but a lot of insights there. And as I say, I think one of the things people sometimes think about archives is that they tell the story of the wealthy, and often they do, because often those are the things that have survived. But we can find in it the comparison between different classes, different life experiences, and also, as I've seen some comments coming up, the fact that archives can continually shine a comparison on the present day. There are still many, many places in the world where one crop failure will lead to complete and utter devastation. And there are still many people in this country who need to go to soup kitchens. And so our records just tell us that continuing human story, I think. I'm going to stop talking. I've run over a bit, so apologies for that. But thank you for joining me for this week. I hope you can join me next week. We'll be looking at farming records. We hold some farming collections within our offices, so we'll have a look at those and see what they can tell us. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, we're very grateful for that. Thank you.